one partner's behavior will activate the other partner's sensitivity that they bring in. So the more, for example, the one partner is demanding for closeness and sending messages and insisting on, I need a response right now, or where are we going for holidays, or whatever the demand is, the other partner may actually feel overwhelmed, unseen, and validated. Essentially, what ends up happening is that the other partner has his or her primary sensitivity activated by that behavior.
Hi, Catalina.
Hi, Ghazaleh.
Such a pleasure to be here with you and having this interview. And I shortly would like to introduce you because, you're a very precious person in the EFT scene. So Dr. Catalina Woldarski-Meneses, she's a clinical psychologist in private practice based in Lausanne, Switzerland. And she has extensive training in emotion-focused therapy. She has published numerous academic papers on the topic of couples therapy and forgiveness. And you also co-authored a book with Leslie Greenberg on the subject, which I read is brilliant. Catalina is a trainer, certified by the International Society for Emotion-Focused Therapy. And she's originally from Chile. She grew up in Canada and studied there, and now you live in Switzerland.
Correct. Yes. And thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's a really great pleasure because, you're also very much specialized on couples. And in the last conference, when I saw you talking about, difficult couples and all of that, I felt like it's so important, this topic, right? Because I don't know about you, but even in my individual sessions, the romantic relationships pop up, right? And
right, they're everywhere, right? And no other area is as embedded. Really, emotions are everywhere, but they're certainly most, I think, pronounced, or we are most sensitive to them in romantic relationships.
Exactly. And then what we work with in emotion-focused therapy, especially helping romantic partners to feel really like, vulnerable with each other, right? And create an emotional safe space together. But often this is so overshadowed by by the residues of past experiences, right? And so out of your experience, what's the biggest impact of childhood trauma on our romantic relationships?
The first thing is to understand that trauma is just quickly a definition. It's either a moment, one particular moment that was experienced with intense helplessness or fear. So it could be a single event like the loss of a parent, or it can be a chronic situation like childhood maltreatment, or what we call complex trauma. So the chronicity is also a factor. So it's not just like a one-time situation. It can be also, for example, being bullied at school, but it's a situation that's experienced as overwhelming for a person. And it actually sets us up, as people for kind of almost like a template that we develop for relationships in the future, especially if the maltreatment or the abandonment is by a caregiver close to us. And so what happens then is people who've had traumatic loss in their life or have experienced complex trauma in their lives is that they end up developing what we call maladaptive emotion schemes, either around the fear of abandonment or the feelings of shame. And so these are the things that get activated in their current relationships. And I always say to couples, we all bring in things from our past. So this is not to say because one partner has had a more quote unquote traumatic past that they're more at fault somehow for the relationship, but it means that we all bring in sensitivities, and that these sensitivities get activated when we're in conflict with our partner.
Yes.
So this is kind of what we end up seeing, either people who are very sensitive to the possibility of being abandoned, the threat of being abandoned, or are very sensitive to feeling inferior or diminished.
Yeah.
Right? So they're hypersensitive.
This is what comes up on the side of the person who feels inferior, right? It's kind of a shutting down and flattening. So can you give us an example how one and the other pop up in behaviors in relationships?
Certainly. So when couples fight, I mean, it's also important to recognize that when we work, at least with the EFTC model as developed by Les Greenberg and Rhonda Goldman, we're talking about, we understand conflict is coming from the unmet needs related to attachments. So it has to do with closeness and responsivity, and also identity, which is the dimension that has to do with validation and feeling esteemed and worthy as a person. So when somebody has a sensitivity to, for example, fear of abandonment, right, more in the attachment domain, what we may end up seeing is that this fear of abandonment may be managed, right, because there's also a piece around emotional regulation. Like, this experience is so distressing that people do different things to soothe themselves. Well, one of those things might be that they become more active in trying to pursue the other. So maybe they'll make a remark that might be might be perceived by the other partner as being really unnecessary or even very mean, but they're essentially efforts to try to keep the other partner engaged. Or they may be clingy behaviors, right? Or maybe somebody who's constantly having to, for example, call their partner or message their partner and needing immediate response and immediate, reaction to their message, because it's otherwise so distressing to feel like their partner may be, interested in other things or not going to come back. And even though it's not rational, I mean, this is the thing, right? There are these internal working models that we end up developing and that end up kind of organizing our current experiences, that overwhelm us as people. And so that might be one example of somebody who has a fear of abandonment that gets activated. They become maybe overly active, but it also may be true that they manifest or they manage that by actually shutting down, right? That the fear becomes so strong that they may take a more withdrawn position.
Yeah.
Right, because people will do all sorts of things to try to manage the pain of not having their needs for closeness or validation met. And
Not feeling that feels kind of safer than expressing that and getting rejected, or when your need is not going to be met, right?
correct.
Of, okay, you're unlovable or not.
Right. And then what ends up happening time and time again, I mean, it's just amazing, is that the one partner's behavior will activate the other partner's sensitivity that they bring in. So the more, for example, the one partner is demanding for closeness and sending messages and insisting on, I need a response right now, or where are we going for holidays, or whatever the demand is, the other partner may actually feel overwhelmed, unseen, and validated. Essentially, what ends up happening is that the other partner has his or her primary sensitivity activated by that behavior. And so then let's imagine, the partner who's on the receiving end of all of these phone calls, all of these messages, ends up feeling quite cornered, and maybe ends up feeling like, I'm not the partner that he or she needs me to be. I can't respond at this level. There's something wrong with me. And their, for example, primary shame gets activated, right? Their underlying feeling of not being good enough gets activated, and it becomes so unbearable, right, that they have to withdraw from the other partner to soothe themselves, essentially, right, to kind of manage these very difficult feelings. But the more that they kind of shut down and keep to themselves, the more the other partner feels rejected and unimportant. And so the more that the first partner will kind of insist on the more pursuing behaviors, as we call them, the going after this person.
Yeah.
And so they're stuck in this negative interactional cycle that we need to change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One question that even came up this morning with the couple for me that comes very much often is when the one looks for validation and appreciation, can you see me? Can you hear me? Are you there? Do you love me? The question comes on the other side, like, what did I do wrong? Right? It's kind of like, again, what did I do wrong? Did I do something wrong? Right? And then.
So you're saying that assumption of I've screwed up somehow, or I haven't quite done this right, gets activated.
Yeah. But you also mentioned the word attachment, right? And what I've been noticing, there's a whole wave about attachment styles you find everywhere, right? There are books on social media, on Google,
Oh
art.
my goodness, is there ever, right? It's really like
Yeah.
everywhere, this term and these styles.
To the therapy, and then they say like, okay, he's avoidant, I'm anxious. Right? And we know everything about this, but somehow, right? So, can you actually tell us a bit about how attachment styles influence our relationships and how much this is also connected to those maladaptive emotional schemes that we internalized, right?
Mhm. So, attachment theory is a theory, right? It was put forth by John Bowlby, and there were initially the research for this theory and how it came about was based on mother-infant interaction. So, this is the work of Mary Ainsworth and others who were really fundamental in giving the attachment a name, a shape, a form, right, as a concept. What ended up happening over the years is that this initial research was then, which was based on the stranger paradigm, where the child is met with an unknown person to them, and the researcher is observing how the child interacts with this unknown person. And then based on different behaviors, they were classified as being either securely attached or insecurely attached. And then there's kind of anyway, classification system that goes with that. Later in like the 1990s, late 80s and 90s, there was a lot of interest in understanding how these same attachment styles manifested in adults. And so that same kind of these research findings, this classification system was then applied to adults in relationship and trying to understand how do adults respond to each other, knowing that they're not equivalent. Infant mother relationship is very different than a partner relationship. But nevertheless, the terms took, and as you're pointing out, now there's this flurry of interest in attachment. But when people come in with these kind of defined terms, I, as a therapist, always kind of obviously take it with a grain of salt, right? There's a lot of information available to people, and everybody loves diagnosing themselves, but I don't actually even know what they're telling me, right? We've got this shorthand term, right? These classification systems of attachment styles that are just that. It's shorthand for something, right? They're condensed terms that actually are trying to capture complex processes. And so when I'm working with a couple, I'm actually more interested in having them see that there is a dynamic aspect
Yeah.
to the way of interacting, right? Because one of the things about coming in with a defined kind of label is that it's fixed, right? It suggests it's static. But when you try to point out that actually, what you call avoidant is coming from a deep fear, and so it's when you feel afraid that your partner will leave that you kind of get into this more clingy behavior, or that you get more into the avoidance style that you take on, you get more withdrawn. So I make a point of differentiating what's the behavior, the thing that you do, and what's the emotion that's underlying it,
Yeah.
right? Because that's really important.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's kind of like he's avoidant, he withdraws, he's the problem.
That's right, right. And so this is the second piece,
I mean,
right?
behavior that comes, I mean, which is maybe very specific for avoidant person or an anxious person, right? And there are behaviors you can see among avoidance, yeah, clients, that they struggle with feeling their emotions, right? And so that's something many of them have in common, for example. But I also find it difficult to label it, because then it becomes like, who is the problem, right? What we try to do is like explaining, actually none of you are the problem. The interaction, the cycle you get lost in, that's the real problem between the two of you.
Exactly. And so that actually is the first part of the therapy, is trying to get both partners on board with this reality, right? This is how we understand the problem to be, that they're both contributing to the problem, that it's not just because one is avoidant or the other one is anxious in terms of their attachment styles that they're having difficulties. It's actually because every time, that her sense of fear of abandonment gets evoked, he ends up feeling inadequate. And so he withdraws even more. And so then she comes after him, right? And they are stuck in the cycle. So the first stage of therapy, right, once we build an alliance and we develop a focus, is actually about cycle de-escalation, but it requires us to have an understanding of like, this is the dance, so to speak, that the two of you have together, and you both contribute to it because you both bring in things from your past.
Absolutely right. So tell me then, how can couples start becoming aware on how those maladaptive emotional schemes or get triggered in the relationship? Because usually couples come to couples therapy, they want to work on their communication, right?
Classic. Yes.
Yeah, we need to find a better way to communicating, right? And then, we work through this and see like it's the cycle, right? That makes kind of a healthy communication difficult, where both feel heard and seen. And so where can couples start to become more aware if they're not reaching out for a couples therapist? Or is that even possible without a couples therapist, right?
Well, I think it's more challenging to do it on your own. It definitely requires a lot of self-awareness, and maybe couples that are less reactive can do it. But the couples who I see in therapy are really reactive, and they're reactive because they're in pain, right? This is also really important. So, when people come in and whatever brings them in, whether it's we don't communicate well or we don't have enough sex or whatever the presenting problem is, my understanding is that this is just a manifestation of a deeper problem, which is that their needs for attachment and identity aren't being met. And probably they're not being met because they're probably not being expressed. And so we've got to work with that. And like you were pointing out, we need to actually get people to be able to own their individual. I mean, you didn't quite say this, but you alluded to, we all have kind of maladaptive emotion schemes, certainly when we are in conflict, that get activated when we are in conflict, right? And in couples where there is ongoing conflict, they're really stuck around this. And so the first step is to be able to own that personally. When couples come into therapy, they're initially looking to kind of blame the other. At least that's my experience, to point out to the other that he or she is the problem. And when you can shift couples from pointing the finger to the other person to being able to actually look within and say, actually, I do recognize that there is a little part of me that gets really overwhelmed or that feels really insufficient at times. And when I feel really insufficient, my tendency is to get very defensive and to talk over you or to, overpower you somehow.
Basically, you just gave an answer, right? It's more like, instead of doing this, right? And this could be the first step, instead of wanting to change your partner and telling him something is wrong with you, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we're looking like, what's happening inside of me, and and why do I react like this, and how does my reaction impact my partner, right?
That's right. Exactly.
Place to start to really do this instead of this.
Yeah. So that's one really important shift, right? Is to be able to actually look within and try to understand, what am I doing that's contributing to this difficulty? And then the second piece, I think the piece we spend a lot of time on in therapy, is getting people to go from a reactive position, which is the defensiveness or the shutting down or the withdrawn or the, arguing, which are all the ways that people protect themselves and defend themselves when they're in conflict, to actually owning and being able to reveal the underlying vulnerability. So the feelings, for example, of sadness or inadequacy or fear that underlie all of the more reactive things that we see when couples are in conflict.
And this comes with a lot of challenges, right? It's easier said than done. I don't know about you. Sometimes I feel frustrated about this because I feel like, oh, we're there, but then it explodes.
It explodes again.
Yeah.
Right? And so, yeah, absolutely. And so it's actually, it takes time, but once you get there, it's actually incredible how vulnerability and the responsiveness to the vulnerability really starts to transform the couple's interactions, right?
So
it's like suddenly
challenges you see in your practice, when people are working on the relationship.
say the first part again.
what are the greatest challenges you face or couples face, right? When they start working on their relationship? Maybe you name the top two of challenges that are typical for couples when I start this journey together.
Hmm. Yeah, so definitely being defensive and blaming the other person rather than owning their contribution to the difficulty is definitely, number one. But then the other ones have to do with, that people have different levels of self-awareness and self-acceptance. So part of it might be initially they're, reacting and trying to defend themselves, but for some people, it's really quite mysterious what's actually going on inside. They don't actually connect with the feelings of perhaps inadequacy, like we've been naming some primary feelings of shame, or the feelings of the fear of abandonment aren't initially available to them. And so it's a process of trying to help people connect with pain that they actually know quite well, because this brings us back to kind of where we started in our conversation today, right? In terms of early experiences in childhood, right? And attachment styles and so on, right? The experiences that we had as growing up in close relationships, generally in our families of origin, will have an impact on how we relate to our partner, right? And so for some people, that's not immediately.
And do you that those people, really need to have an individual therapy next to the couples therapy? Because sometimes I feel like when people really struggle with that mystery, you said mysterious, right? Then I'm wondering if they would do individual therapy, it would help the couples process. If they would figure out a bit more about themselves, about helping them to get more in touch with their feelings. Or is it possible to do couples therapy without the other person or not doing individual therapy?
Well, it's certainly beneficial, right? I don't make it certainly a condition, right? But I do, highlight that it can be useful to have an understanding of where these reactions come from, and have a more compassionate attitude, perhaps, for some people, to that underlying pain that drives the reactivity. So it can be useful, and it's also possible to do couples therapy without having both partners be in individual therapy. And then it requires, though, as a therapist, to be more explicit in terms of making links, but also being able to really work collaboratively with both partners, and not to define them as well and say, well, listen, I understand your mother died when you were 6 years old. Surely that's left a scar. And they're saying, no, it hasn't. You've got to find a way to kind of connect these two things and be able to actually have that be within the client's kind of window of tolerance in terms of, and also capacity to accept these two things, right? Because we don't want to define people, right? And when we're working in this model, it's an experiential model. So we've got to be able to also attend to that. Otherwise, it's just descriptive. And when it's descriptive, it's not experiential. And the whole therapy hinges on, we're going to create new experiences in the context of the therapy that is going to transform the relationship. So there's a lot of balancing that therapists need to do.
Can you give, what would be the most powerful advice you would give partners who want to feel more emotionally connected? One powerful advice, the one that...
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is to take a risk and be vulnerable, right? And it's not easy, even though in your head, like, this would, be an important step. Once you're able to do it, once you're able to acknowledge to your partner that sometimes you feel really unloved, or sometimes you feel, rather than saying, you're so terrible and you say mean things, to be able to say, I feel so belittled or unseen, to be able to own that vulnerability and show it to your partner is actually an important first step.
So it's vulnerability that connects, right?
Vulnerability and responsiveness to the vulnerability, because I think that first step is critical. People sometimes get stuck on, well, I don't understand why he's so needy, or I don't understand why he feels so inadequate. I haven't really been that critical. The thing is, partners don't have to understand their other, their partner's sensitivities. They just have to accept it, right? And that's really different. So just being able to accept that, even though that particular, response isn't part of your lived experience, it's part of his or hers. And so it evokes a whole set of, responses in the,
Yeah.
and so responsiveness is also really important.
Risking, reaching, and responding.
Risking, reaching, and responding. That's nice.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, Catalina, I could talk about this topic for hours, right? And to really dive into this deeper, because it's such a topic that we all know. I don't know about you, but I know that very well. You know what's get lost in those cycles, right? But unfortunately, our time is over now.
Well, thank you so much.
As you can see, we all bring sensitivities into our relationships and get caught up in vicious cycles that are just bringing us apart. You're not the problem, and your partner is not the problem. Thank you for watching this interview, and stay tuned for other interviews coming up on my YouTube channel. Bye.